general, many people have benefited from economic growth in China. And you can talk to people who, from our estimation, might not have done very well over the past 30 years, who are, working in a factory, working on a farm, cleaning the streets, these sort of people that I talk to a lot in doing my research. And a lot of times they're more optimistic, certainly than I am, about what's happening in China. So, I think people, there's better access to clean water, there's better access to decent housing and things like that. And I think that is the kind of thing that certainly has trickled down. So I certainly don't mean to suggest that you have this 1% of the population that is capturing all of the benefits of growth. What I think is an issue is that given how fast China has been growing, right, averaging above 8%, 9% for all of these years, that the overwhelming majority of the fruits of that growth are going to a pretty small number. And I think that there's, this is hard to quantify, but having been in China for a number of years, this feeling over the past few years that people are just not, that their chances, their opportunities are limited, So there's this kind of the Chinese dream, which people are talking about now. I think in the 80s there was a sense, well, you can go to Shenzhen, right, one of these special economic zones, with nothing, and overnight you can become sort of a successful entrepreneur if you work hard or not. Well, this is, of course, a myth to some extent, but it is, I think, grounded in some things which actually happened. For now, you have the sort of second generation of migrant workers, right, or even the third generation. So their parents who began working in the late 1970s now have children or potentially even grandchildren. And if they're doing the same thing that their parents are doing, well, then you begin to see sort of the rigidification of a class structure where people can't do better than their parents. So in China, access to what you might call political capital, right, knowing the right people within the government, is much more important than it would be certainly than in the United States or many other countries. And so we've seen some exposés over the past few years where they look at the total wealth of the family of, say, Wen Jiabao. This was the New York Times did a big report on this, found that Wen Jiabao, the former premier's family, had assets of, I think it was $2.7 billion, right? So these people who are powerful within the state can convert that political capital into economic capital. Of course, the United States has the sort of revolving door thing going on with the lobbyists, but the sort of the level of access to wealth that you get from being at the top of the Chinese political hierarchy, I think, probably surpasses. The thing that I think is hopeful about China is that you have at least rhetoric and to some extent action coming from the central government, which seems like they're cognizant of these problems with inequality. They talk about inequality and they say, we know that China has these sorts of problems and we have to address them. And I think that that's better in many ways in China than it is in the United States. So there is a political will to address some of these problems. And that makes me hopeful. I think the problem, and this leads into the question of my fears, is that they're willing to address economic inequality, but political inequality, right, or political democracy remains something that is completely not under discussion in China. And so I think the big question for China in the next 10, 15, 20 years is, can they secure greater economic democracy without changing political democracy? If we can look at what's going on in Hong Kong right now, where there's an intense debate about the future of democracy in the special administrative region, it's very clear that Beijing is unwilling to compromise at all in the question of political democracy, even in the case of Hong Kong, which has its own separate political and legal institutions. So my fear is, in essence, that those people that have benefited from this arrangement up till now will refuse to make any sort of political changes, and that the refusal to make those kinds of political changes will make the kinds of economic changes that they're talking about impossible. And if that's the case, this is a situation which is in some ways similar to things that happened in Latin America in the 20th century, where you have sort of a stagnation in the economy, these elites locking in their advantages, persistent inequality, which is politically problematic, but ultimately comes to sap the vitality of economic growth as well. If the question is, well, reducing inequality or expanding social services, then all of a sudden I see consensus within the party breaking down. And then you begin to have all kinds of contestation at different levels. So at that point, the question is, well, if this is what China needs to do, which I think it does, where's the political force going to come to make that happen? Now, it could come from a different political party, but I think that allowing, for instance, an expansion of civil society, allowing for an expansion of other kinds of representative organizations. I study labor, so you could imagine worker organizations, peasant-based organizations, even within still a one-party state, that they could have some sort of political power, but also the sort of the interest to push through these kinds of reforms in a way that I simply don't believe the Communist Party has.
How seriously do you take the leadership when they say they favor consultative democracy?
Not seriously.
Okay, why is that?
You know, we've seen language of democracy going back to the state socialist period. You know, I can talk about my own research where within enterprises they talk about this thing called democratic management, right, where workers are supposed to have some sort of say in the way that production is organized. This doesn't happen. Today, anyway, it doesn't happen. The 50s and 60s may have been a different thing. But so this language has appeared in party rhetoric for a long time. The situation remains today more or less as it ever, and today may even be worse than previously, where people don't have any confidence to voice their opinions. And I'm of the belief that even if you were to give sort of individuals the right to voice their opinions, that this is still insufficient, that in order to have meaningful consultation, you need to be able to have some sort of collective bodies, right, which can articulate specific interests and then represent these different groups. And I don't think anybody in China has the confidence to sort of say, hey, Communist Party, we really disagree with what you're doing, and we're going to do everything we can to try to prevent you from doing that. It's an incredibly dangerous situation. And you can look at the political dissidents that they still have locked up today, and I think that's a good indication that this is not that meaningful. So I think if the party had the confidence, in essence, to sort of say, hey, we're going to pull back a little bit, we're going to allow for some of these other interests to constitute themselves, I really don't think that this poses a major threat to social stability. The alternative, right, which is sticking with the status quo, which is certainly for the short term what's going to happen, it's clear that they're not going to compromise, is that you trust that the Communist Party is going to make the right decision. And I think that if we look at the kinds of decisions they've been making, there's a lot of reason to not trust them.
So what about this guy? Should we see him as someone who will move China forward in the way of rebalancing? Should we see him as someone who will build repressive ramparts around a political elite that's challenged?
Unfortunately, my fear is that it's the latter.
Huh.
I think thus far there have been a number of things that he's done which are cause for concern. Well, let me first deal with the hopeful side of things. I think this anti-corruption stuff, initially I just completely dismissed it out of hand and said, you know, these anti-corruption campaigns come around every once in a while and you're supposed to do it. But, you know, it does seem to be more intensive than has been the case previously. And, you know, there's some other indicators which I think are a sign of hope. You know, the sale of luxury goods in Hong Kong, right, has dropped. Sort of gambling revenue in Macau has dropped. So these to me are interesting indicators that something is happening. You know, I think ultimately if you're going to deal with corruption, that there needs to be some other kind of institutional reform and creating real sort of oversight and accountability of party members, which is not in place and is not really under discussion in any serious way. This is still, as far as the party is concerned, an internal matter. You know, I should say that speculating about what's happening inside the Communist Party is, you know, you can sort of come up with whatever theory you want to. So whether this is he really believes it or, you know, whether this is just factional infighting, I don't know the answer. But, you know, it does seem like there's been some consequences from it, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. On the other hand, coming back to the fears, I think that this increase in repressive capacity domestically is a really major concern. China now spends more money on internal security than they spend on national defense. They've really beefed up these so-called stability maintenance committees, which exist at all levels of the state. Their response to this recent terrorist events, which they're attributing to the Uyghur minority in the Northwest, is quite terrifying. I mean, it's essentially a permanent police state now in Xinjiang province. Their inability to deal with the problem in Tibet, and as a result, people engaging in all these self-immolations is a big concern. So I do see an increase in repressive capacity internally, and I think that's cause for concern. Talking about international relations is another whole can of worms, which I probably shouldn't open up now, but I also think that there's causes for concern on that front with China acting somewhat more aggressively, and I think that these two things are interconnected in some ways. So if he's going to deal with this question of economic rebalancing, my position is still they're going to have to do something different politically to deal with these economic problems, and I think that the increase in repression internally does not bode particularly well for that.
I think it's very difficult to reduce these things to authoritarian or not, and I think a lot of ink has been wasted on that. And I think one of the other questions then one has to ask, which is related to your second question, is, okay, even if we accept maybe that's been viable, does it produce long-term stability and growth? And there, I think most historical experience shows that sooner or later, that kind of model becomes redundant just because of the complexities of a modern society and the diversity that produces. It becomes very difficult to contain within a one-party structure. I mean, essentially what you have at the moment is an 86 million person party ruling China, and it has to prevent political fragmentation. It has to import into itself all the important social forces and diverse groups within society, or find ways to control them through, not allowing independent trade unions, not allowing an independent women's federation, and so on. And so structuring interest representation in a certain way. But it really means that you're importing the contradictions within society into your own ruling party, and you hope that those things can be fought out within that party and come to some kind of resolution which becomes unanimous. And again, as I said, I'm not sure over time whether that really maintains its viability. I mean, even Chairman Mao, said one day there won't be a Communist Party. And that's certainly true. I mean, there might be a Communist Party, but it might necessarily be the ruling party in China. But, whether that's decades away or a few years away is almost impossible to tell. Then the question becomes, what might replace it? And there you have a range, I think, of different options, from what the optimists would like to see of a transition through hard to soft authoritarianism, where you might argue where China is at the moment, to some kind of democratic breakthrough in the way of Taiwan and South Korea, as they did before. But you can also look at the other extremes of that spectrum, where it might be a Putin-esque style regime. It might be a Latin American type regime before democratization, where you have an intensely integrated global elite, which is benefiting from the global economy, a relatively affluent middle class, but a very strong underclass, which you use the apparatus of the state to repress those groups, workers, migrants, some of the farmers, in the name of maintaining social stability, to allow continued accumulation of wealth by the elites and the growing middle class. I mean, I think all those options are on the table for China.
Within the party, in academic life, and one hopes in the country at large, wherever your experience is there a discussion that makes you hopeful that things will be worked out in the direction of something like multi-party democracy, which I must say is emerging to me from your discussion as the hopeful solution for the long run?
Well, certainly something that allows, differentiation and diversity to be expressed. I mean, is what one would hope for. There are a lot of smart people in China. They're perfectly aware of these problems. There have been varied debates at different times. There was a fascination within the Chinese Communist Party about social democracy, whether that might be a future solution and a way forward. That really sort of stopped about 10 years ago, that discussion. I know other academics who have had more fearful projections, have talked about the Latin Americanization of the Chinese body politic. So there's a lot of debate that's alive, and well out there. And I think, a recognition that ultimately this system will not perpetuate itself, but, how you make that transition and how it ends, I don't think anybody has any real idea about, either inside China or outside of China. But I think the last comment I would make, and I've made this on a number of occasions, I think China will be fine. There's a lot of positives in China. Whether China will be fine with or without the Communist Party, that's the open question.